Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. It's another mini review video, and this is probably going to be the last one that I post until, well, it's the last one I'm going to post before I leave for my vacation. I leave probably today by the time this video is uploaded. And I was going to make this a longer one. I was going to do like 10 or 11 mini album reviews, but I eventually ran out of time. I wanted to get this posted before I go on vacation, so some of these reviews might be a little bit brief, but some of these albums I did realize I wanted to give a bit more time and attention, which is part of the reason why I'm not doing as many reviews in this post as I was planning on. I thought I was going to be able to get like 10 or 11 of them done in time before my vacation, but some of these albums were kind of tricky, and I had to actually give them a few more listens if I wanted to really review them properly, I guess you could say. But as always, take all of my opinions with a grain of salt. I say all the time, I don't really know what I'm talking about in these videos. So these are just my personal thoughts on these albums. We got 7 albums I want to talk about today. And yeah, these are all just my personal opinions. Let me know yours in the comments if you wish to do so. Let's start off the reviews with... So I'll admit, I don't really know much about Fernando Motta, other than that he's a shoegaze artist from Brazil who's been releasing albums for about a decade now. And I'm pretty sure this is his 4th studio album, his 4th solo studio album. Now, I've always had a bit of a complicated relationship with shoegaze and other adjacent genres, mostly because as I've gotten older, I've started caring less about vibes in music and more about real impact and memorability. Although that's only to a certain point. And I'm not even sure how relevant it is for me to bring that up, because a lot of dream pop and shoegaze can be quite memorable, and when it's well produced, I can really get into it. And I saw a feature on this album from Terra Plana, whose 2023 debut I barely remember, but whenever I go back to it, I've always really enjoyed it. Probably still a great album. And on that note, I should probably revisit it and also check out their album from this year, which I just found out is a thing while researching for this review. But back on the topic of Fernando Motta, well, I'm honestly a little bit surprised how much I enjoyed this album. And it's not because there was any indication I got that this would be bad, or even bland or forgettable. It's just that a lot of shoegazy, dreamy, mellow rock can blur together and just get lost in the endless array of albums that just feel like they're throwing paint at a wall to see what sticks. And while a lot of it is good, it doesn't feel particularly memorable or interesting. And that might be a bit ironic for me to say, considering that really only time will tell how memorable or catchy this ends up being. But as of right now, I'm actually enjoying this album a lot more than I thought I would. And honestly, it feels like an album that, with the right promotion and other surrounding factors, had this been released in the 1990s, people might be looking back at it as a classic. And put this up against any Slowdive album, I'm most likely taking this any day of the week. Now, I do want to first quickly mention the lyrics, which are in Portuguese, so it's hard for me to have a proper opinion on them. And after looking at some of the translations, they certainly looked interesting, but the language barrier for me, as someone who only knows English, does make it harder for me to connect with this as fully as I'd like. But also, there's a part of me that wonders if that's even a bad thing, because albums like this one and this style of music typically seem to be more about the vibe and getting lost in the experience, rather than having any actual strong meaning. In other words, if I did understand the lyrics better, it might make me like the album less. It's hard to say. And look, for starters, this is amazingly well produced. The drums sound super crisp and really provide such a smooth texture to these instrumentals. The guitars are well mic'd and sound great in the mix. And while there is a bit of a foggy atmosphere across most of this record, I actually think it fits quite well, especially with the beautiful vocals that almost act as a silver lining amidst the fog. I'm not too confident these individual songs are going to stand out that much for me in the long run, but as a full project, I am impressed by the consistency and just the atmosphere and mood that this album encapsulates across the entire record. Pretty much all the way through, this album is impressively pretty, and the short running time means I might end up going back to this quite a bit. Like I said, I'm about to go on vacation, I'm going on a road trip, and this could be a big part of my soundtrack, and I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up growing on me a lot. For now, it's a light 8 out of 10, and I might end up getting sick of it if I overplay it, but I think it's more likely it grows on me. And it's why albums like these are a big part of the reason why I'm so glad I changed my rating system, because it allows more flexibility within each number. Obviously, opinions change, but it even makes it easier for me to rate it in the moment. All of that aside, though, I would at least recommend checking out a few tracks here and there to see if you like this. And honestly, you know what, considering this is just over a half hour, I think you may as well listen to the whole thing all the way through. It's better than most of the shoegaze you're going to hear this year, and I think it's pretty great and will absolutely be a contender for my year-end list. Fingers crossed I don't have to cancel my top 50 albums again, because albums like this one remind me why I love reviewing music. I also realize that makes it sound like I'm overhyping this, which I probably am. But hey, I still think this is pretty great. I'd say check out this album. I think it's worth it. This is the third studio album by Fourth Wanderers, and it's their first in over 7 years following a very long hiatus. Which might explain why I never heard of this band before, at least as far as I can remember. But they do seem to be mostly well liked by the critics who have listened to them, but not exceptionally. So I was expecting some standard indie rock that sounds totally designed for rock radio. That's typically what we get when I see a critical reception like this one, because a lot of that stuff just blurs together for me. But you know what? I'm not totally sure that's what we got. I mean, yeah, don't get me wrong. A lot of this album feels like stuff I've heard before a million times, or at least that I've heard done better with more experimentation. But it's also not a complete misfire, and on about my fourth listen to this album, I realized I wanted to give this the proper time and attention it deserves, despite my massive time crunch. One of the reasons why there's less album reviews in this video than I was planning. Because throughout the first leg of this record, from the opening track to about the halfway point, this actually reminded me of Feeble Little Horse's 2023 album Girl with Fish, in the way it subtly leaves a lot of impact despite having a fairly generic style and sound. Although here there's less experimentation and the distortion doesn't quite hit as hard. And I can respect the band for thinking outside the box a little bit and not committing to the standard indie rock formula, especially because so many albums in this vein can end up blending together and just feeling redundant and uninteresting. Whereas this album has a bit more going for it, but I'm unfortunately not sure how memorable this album's best songs are going to be, and that's especially a problem when the latter parts of the album lose that sense of self-identity, and it starts to go a bit all over the place while sacrificing the energy that makes the first half of the album mostly enjoyable. Now, this album isn't all bad. In fact, I don't think it's bad at all, outside of 7 Months, which is a flat-out headache. Especially because there are moments that I like a lot, such as probably my favorite track, Springboard, with its eerie guitars and filthy drum production that absolutely hits. And again, I admire the band's willingness to be their own unique thing, or at least to attempt that. Because I'll admit, this is far from the most unique album I've heard, even this year alone, even in the first half of the record. But it does lead to moments like Call You Back, with a nice guitar and bass pairing that leaves one of the stronger grooves on this album, and it's quite funky. Or there's also the opening track, which feels kind of Radiohead inspired, and I think they mostly make good use of that influence. And I like the vocal performance on Honey more than the majority of this album, and the vocals across the album are not bad by any means. Now, lyrically, this doesn't give me much to say because there aren't a lot of lyrics on this record, but I also think that may be part of a larger narrative where the lack of communication is key to these frustrating situations accentuated by the borderline punk elements of the instrumentation and vocal delivery. And by the end of the album, the narrator seems to make a realization of needing to be authentic, even though that can be hard to do. I mean, what even is authenticity? And yeah, it's not a bad concept, if this is even what the band is trying to do. But I don't know, something feels missing here. I can occasionally get behind this kind of abstract writing and find my own meaning in it where it really resonates for me, even when the songs aren't particularly catchy. But here I'm just left feeling underwhelmed, and maybe it's due to a slight feeling of pretentiousness. And I don't like using the P word, considering how much pretentiousness my reviews contain, but it does seem to be a little too prominent to making an album like this work, and maybe I'm just a little too self-aware to fall for that trick. So, strong 6 out of 10 for me, and honestly, I'd say take it or leave it. If you're up for a challenge to try and find your own meaning in art that wants you to unpack lots of layers that aren't really there, then absolutely give this a shot. But I usually just review what's right in front of me, and when I'm not instantly gripped by an album, it can be kind of hard to just reshape my thinking. So yeah, I wish I liked this a lot more than I do, but I can't force it here as much as they might want me to. So, it's about time I finally got around to reviewing this album, because despite a lot of critics' disappointment in her album that she dropped last year, this new album of hers has been way more critically acclaimed, possibly the most of any of her albums. Now, I didn't take the time to listen to her previous albums and decided to go into this record with no idea what to expect other than that it would be some mellow R&B, and that's exactly what we got, although the production leaves quite a bit of room for experimentation. And yeah, I think this was designed to be a multiple listen album, and while I always listen to albums multiple times before I review them, or I should say almost always, I did give this one a few extra listens because I wanted to fully take it in and let it wash over me and take the time to process it. Again, another reason why there's not as many reviews in this video as I was hoping for. I'm still preparing for my vacation. I haven't even packed yet. Because this isn't designed for instantly punchy hooks or infectious melodies, but rather it's a lot more subtle and low-key, even with the moments that do aim to be a little poppier, more accessible, or even radio-friendly. And I'm not talking about lyrics there. I don't even think there's one curse word on this album. I forgot to pay attention, but I don't think there is. So about a half dozen listens into this half-hour-long album, or maybe even more listens, I lost count. Do I at least like it? Well, yeah, I do, but I also feel like something's missing, and I think it's because after giving this so many listens, I've started to realize that the melodies and compositions aren't really that strong, at least according to my ears. And it's not just because it's so subtle. The subtlety is something that I could get past with enough listens and time and attention given to process the album. And while I think this album has its moments, like the gorgeous string-infused You Can't Always Get What You Want, not a Rolling Stones cover by the way, and December with such beautifully crisp drums and a very pleasant vocal delivery, most of these tracks, even the ones that I do like, aren't really blowing my mind songwriting-wise. Now, when it comes to the production on this album, well, I actually think it's really solid. There are a few moments where the mix can get a bit cluttered, like Seasons, or a little bit on You Got It, but I like how well the strings blend with the rest of the soundscapes on most of these tracks, and Erika's vocals are well placed in the mix. It's also worth mentioning that Erika de Casier is a really good singer, which especially shines through on the elegant You Can't Always Get What You Want, the opening track Miss, December, which is one of my favorite tracks here, and Seasons, which could have been a really good song if the mixing wasn't an absolute mess. One of the only moments here where I specifically don't like the production. Both musically and lyrically, this album seems to be aiming for a very lush, sensual vibe, and it doesn't shy away from more introspection and acknowledging the humanity behind it all. And I like albums like that, especially with such sexy production. I feel like this should be totally clicking for me. But again, it comes back to a lot of these songs feeling like they don't really go anywhere, and I just don't think the songwriting is all that special. So if there's any confusion, I do think this is a good album, but I don't think I'll be going back to it much, at least not as a whole. Also, before I end this review, I want to quickly mention that Delusional is a song that really should be great, and it's still really damn good, but for some ungodly reason, they decided to add a sound effect that sounds like a horse in the middle of the chorus. Why? Anyway, enough of my complaining. I do still think this is a good album. I'll give it at least a light 7 out of 10, could be a stronger 7 depending on the moment, but especially toward the end of the album, it kind of falls off. With the exception of the great closing track, Lifetime, that is. And I just don't think there's enough uniqueness or fully fleshed out ideas to make this a great album. It is good, but despite all the critical acclaim, I wouldn't call it essential listening. If you have the time and you're really into R&B and mellow pop music, then it's worth a shot, but I just don't think it's totally for me. So this is the second time since I started this YouTube channel under a year ago that I'm reviewing a Tyler the Creator album. This time his new surprise album, Don't Tap the Glass, which comes 9 months after his surprise album Chromacopia that dropped last year. And I would make a joke and say that that album had a child which was just born now, except this album is actually quite different from Chromacopia in a lot of ways. But I'll get to that in a minute, because going into this album, I decided to go through some of Tyler's other albums, skipping his first 4 because I don't think they're very good and I didn't want to spend extra time on that. But I listened to his 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th albums, each all the way through to refresh my mind. I had listened to all of his albums before this, but I only went back and revisited those ones in preparation for this review. And I still stand by Flower Boy being a great album, albeit not the masterpiece so many critics seem to think it is. And I also unfortunately stand by what I said last year, that Igor is really only decent, at least to me. The story throughout the album wasn't compelling, Tyler's singing wasn't very strong, the production was very hit or miss, probably emphasis on miss, and by the time the album ends, it's almost like it never even happened. Yeah, there's the occasional good moment, and I respect the artistic ambition on that album, but I don't think it's realized at all. And I've never really loved Call Me If You Get Lost either. I like it a hell of a lot better than Igor, but it's also overly long, and there aren't enough standout tracks to make it not feel a little bit tedious, even though I do still mostly like that album. I'd say it's a very good album, but I don't quite think it's great. So while I'm still going with the hot takes, I actually think Chromacopia is my favorite of Tyler's albums, and it's not particularly close. Seriously, if I hadn't canceled my top 50 albums of 2024, that album probably would have been damn close to the top 10, top 20 at least. So if you know me and have heard me talk about Tyler the Creator, it might be easy to forget that I'm mostly a Tyler the Creator fan. If you can look past my thoughts on Igor, which might be one of my biggest music hot takes ever, and I'm one of those annoying the Beatles were overrated people. And it's why I'm really disappointed to say that I think this album is a bit shy of greatness, despite having a lot going for it. It's not all bad, not even close, but I'm definitely underwhelmed, and maybe that comes from the expectations that Chromacopia left me with going into this album. Now, the first thing I want to mention is that this isn't a concept album, and I'm pretty sure there isn't meant to be a lot of depth on this album. It seems like a record that doesn't really require a whole lot of thought, which on the bright side makes for an easier album for me to review, but I do miss a lot of the more thought-provoking lyrics of Chromacopia, and even Flower Boy and Call Me If You Get Lost. This album opens with the Pharrell collab called Big Po, and this track opens with some instructions for the album, like how the listener should be dancing and also letting Tyler do whatever the fuck he wants. Seems to be the meaning of this album's title. And it's just a shame that the album doesn't go harder, especially because this is a really strong opening track that seems to set up an album full of total bangers, with a great drum production on this track and great chemistry between Tyler and Pharrell, and some epic synthesizers as well, and the Busta Rhymes sample fits really great too. But throughout the rest of the album, I don't know, it's not clicking as much as I'd like. And it starts with the second track, Sugar on My Tongue, which might be one of Tyler's worst tracks, excluding his early material. The chorus isn't very good, and the lyrics are really cheesy in a way that could have worked with different music to pair with it, but here it's just kind of a mess. Now, I do in some ways appreciate Tyler's willingness to deliver something his fans probably weren't expecting, a more simple, straightforward dance album. And I think there's less emphasis on the lyrics and more on his admittedly strong flows and opulent instrumentals, which do have a lot of nice layers to them. Even aside from that, there are good lines here and there. I like the apparent Roddy Ricch The Box reference on Sucka Free, and I got hugs in my home, bitch, I can't relate on the title track. Oh, and in the second half of that track, I fucked her and her friend, her N-word, and his bitch. I know I'm wrong. And that last one is one of many lines where the delivery is what makes it work so well, which is something I can say about a lot of this album. And I also do think this album is quite well produced. On that note, I actually forgot that Tyler produces his own albums, and he's been pretty consistent in that department over the past decade or so, in terms of quality, in my opinion, with the exception of Igor. Although even that album had well-produced moments, I'll admit. But yeah, Don't Tap the Glass usually places Tyler's vocals in the right spots in the mix, the synths and drums pair together really well, and the grooves are allowed to fully pop off. But I just don't find this album as catchy or fully fleshed out writing-wise as Tyler can be at his best. So for me, I'll take the opener, Big Po, which I already mentioned, the grimy dance track, Stop Playing With Me, which has a great chorus and a great display of confidence. It's a great song, despite a weird moment where he compares himself to Osama bin Laden, but I know he's not being serious. And also the excellent, versatile title track is also a big highlight for me, possibly the best song on the album. Oh yeah, and then there's also I'll Take Care of You, a more experimental track, which feels kind of Flower Boy-esque, and I really like that one as well. The rest of the album is, well, mostly good, but just not really doing anything to stand out to me all that much, beyond being well-produced dance hip-hop, which is still very pleasant to listen to. So, you know what? Yeah, well, this isn't my favorite Tyler album or anywhere close. It's still absolutely worth hearing, and it's got a pretty short runtime too, which makes for a much breezier listen that I don't think you'll regret. 7 out of 10 for me. I just hope this is more of a side album between his higher concept, more thought-provoking projects. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. So this review is going to be pretty brief, just like the album is. It's a half-hour breakup album following Jade Bird's breakup with her ex-fiancé, and it's her third studio album to date. Now, I'll admit I haven't heard either of her previous 2 albums, but I had heard mostly good things about her as an artist, although I hadn't really looked at a lot of opinions on this album going into this review, so I had no idea what to expect. And yeah, we certainly got a breakup album, although I'd say this album is a lot closer to country than I was expecting. But it does come with soaring hooks and at least attempts at grandeur, which are apparent from the first few tracks, because there seems to be a sense of freedom that Jade tries to convey, despite this loss, or maybe more because of it, as difficult as it is to go through. I like the sense of disbelief in the opening track, and then the realization that it needed to come to an end on the following Nobody. And I also like how she wonders about the other perspective on Glad You Did, and how she finally admits that all along they both kind of felt deep down like it wasn't meant to last, on Somebody New. one of the most vulnerable moments on the album. And I do think this album is mostly well produced, with Jade's vocals sounding really good in the mix, even though I'm not super captivated by her vocals. She's not a bad singer, but there's nothing about her as a vocalist that really wows me personally. She definitely conveys emotion well, but it just doesn't feel particularly memorable. And sometimes her vocals can be a bit much on tracks like Avalanche and Dreams. But yeah, the instrumentation clashes together in a mostly smooth way that I think helps these songs become as anthemic as intended, or at least almost as much, even though I don't find the melodies and compositions particularly captivating a lot of the time. But I do like the blend of country with indie rock, and it seems like Jade is making the most of this change in her life, just based on what this album would suggest, not just in the lyrics, but in the hopeful instrumentation and vocals. I honestly think its biggest sin is just not being particularly unique to my ears. And honestly, that kinda sums up the album. It's definitely a good breakup album that will try to pull at your heartstrings, but I'm just not sure how memorable it will be. Notice I said I'm not sure, not that I'm guaranteed to forget this came out. I'll give it a 7 out of 10. It doesn't hit super hard for me, but I can respect the artistry and acknowledge what it does well. But I also do love country music, so even though I wasn't blown away by it, I did still enjoy this album. Alright, these last two reviews are probably not going to make a lot of people happy, especially the last one, but before we get to that, here we have HAIM's 4th studio album, and it's the first album of theirs that I've listened to up to this point. The only song of theirs I really knew going into this album was The Steps, which I like, but I've never really loved. And I have heard songs featuring members of the band, including Danielle Haim's feature on Bon Iver's newest album, which I just reviewed in the last episode of this mini-review series. But again, this is the first time I've listened to a HAIM album. So, my first experience with an album by this sister trio, and, well, based on some interviews I saw, it seems like the main theme of this album is letting go of things that weren't serving you for the better. In other words, quitting your unhealthy habits and getting out of unhealthy situations. It's also the first album this band has made where all 3 members were single at the same time. At least I think that's what I heard them say in an interview. And it definitely shows in some of these songs, like Relationships, which feature lines like, I think I'm in love, but I can't stand fucking relationships. As that song seems to be about just that, feeling like you want the ideal perfect relationship, but then struggling with the reality of it as the perfect relationship doesn't actually exist. And the lack of commitment that is clearly communicated on All Over Me also makes for a very notable moment on the album, describing a hookup partner who the narrator feels passionately about, but not in an emotional way, or at least not how it might seem on the surface. But they're still both being treated as equals in this narrative. So yes, I Quit seems to represent freedom and having the ability to create the life for yourself that you truly want without needing to rely on others. But it also acknowledges the desire for human connection and the nostalgia for times in the past where you were a different version of yourself, with Take Me Back being a very nostalgic moment as the title would imply, where you feel pulled back to a moment or phase in the past you wish you could get back, and sometimes we can appreciate the ways we've grown and evolved while still longing for the past in a strange way, even if we don't totally want to go back. But before I get sidetracked going down that rabbit hole, freedom is a very solid theme across this album, while also acknowledging that you're going to face struggles no matter what. And I think it shines through in the instrumentation, because this doesn't hold back from sounding as raw as possible, without any overproduction or feeling too popified. And I can very much respect the band and producers for taking that route, because it does make sense. Until you realize that they may have cared a bit too little about polishing this album up. Because make no mistake, this album really could have used at least a little bit of shiny gloss in the production to make this pop off a little bit more, as opposed to the clunky percussion of The Farm, which stands out way more than it should, the annoying clicking percussion of Million Years, and especially the mixing on Spinning, which is a really embarrassing dance cut that doesn't go nearly as hard as they think it does. If this song played on the dance floor, I'd be the first to leave the party. For fuck's sake, even Drake could probably make a better dance song than this. And on a different note, while we're talking about problems that hold this album back for me, well, I'm not sure how much of this is a problem and how much of it is just a me thing, probably more the latter, but I often struggle with long albums unless I find them compelling all the way through. And this album is almost an hour long. And look, it's not that I don't think it has its moments, because there are definitely good songs on this album, but not only are there very few, if any, that I would consider exceptional, the vast majority of this album feels held back by extremely messy production, and also I've just never been super captivated by Danielle as a vocalist. Yeah, she can convey emotion quite well, and technically speaking, she's definitely got a knack for singing, but I think it's a bit of an Adele situation for me, where technically good vocals don't necessarily mean I'm going to love listening to it. That's been the reason why I've always struggled to get into Adele's music, and it's the same thing here, although I unfortunately have to say Danielle Haim is nowhere near as impressive a singer as Adele is. And it's not even like the compositions on this album are particularly strong anyway. Maybe technically speaking, there's more to them, which might explain Haim's popularity, but either we get songs that directly sample classics and just feel like they're different versions of the original, or maybe that's not fair. Maybe it just feels like they don't really do much particularly interesting with the samples. Or these tracks just feel like generic radio filler. But okay, I did say there are good songs in this album, so I may as well acknowledge them and explain why. Love You Right is one of the few moments where I like the production, and it has a nice musical and melodic progression and evolution throughout. Try to Feel My Pain is a nice low-key, groovy song with a bit of a danceable feel to it that I mostly like, even though it reminds me a bit too much of Milky Chance's Stolen Dance, a song that I can't stand. And Down to Be Wrong has a good melodic chorus that makes good use of the acoustic guitar with some backing vocals that add some real texture to this mix. And I especially like the shoegazy love song Lucky Stars, which doesn't try too hard to be more than what it is, and as a result ends up as a breezy mellow rocker. And All Over Me might be this album's best song, with the sort of honest lyrics that pair really well with such bright melodies and sexy production that really enhances the mood the song is aiming for. And that crunchy electric guitar in the chorus is the cherry on top. But none of this is enough to save this nearly hour-long project from being painfully dull and forgettable throughout the majority of the track list. In fact, I'm not even sure painfully is the right word, because that makes it sound like this album is bad, or at least really mediocre, and I'm not even sure it is, as much as it is a huge example of wasted potential. Because I'm all for an album about escaping bad situations and making the most of your life without giving too many fucks. It's just that for an album like this, while I wouldn't want it to be overproduced or overpolished, I was hoping it would have a bit more energy and life to it, which the messy rawness of the sound doesn't really bring to this album. So yeah, in other words, I think it honestly sounds a bit underproduced. I don't know, maybe this just isn't for me. But look, I can acknowledge there are moments that mostly work, and they do sometimes have a knack for melodies, but it's just too hit or miss for me to go higher than a 6 out of 10 on the full project. Albeit probably a fairly strong 6 out of 10, because I like a lot of what this album is trying to do. But with great effort doesn't always come great results, and here that unfortunately rings very true. Alright, to end out this video, we got the second studio album from Wet Leg, and I'll be honest, I almost completely forgot that this band existed. And that's as someone who was actually pretty excited for their debut album 3 years ago, which was preceded by the viral single Chaise Longue, which got a lot of critical acclaim, only to lead to a really disappointing album. And honestly, revisiting that album recently in preparation for this review, I was actually surprised how little I liked it. I didn't love it at the time, but now I like it considerably less. It's really a front-loaded album with only one true great song and a bunch of total duds near the end, with Oh No being absolute dog shit. I think the biggest thing that annoyed me about Wet Leg is the really corny sense of humor that they couldn't pull off. It was paired with mostly straightforward indie rock grooves and choruses which seemed more fitting for more serious music. And look, it's not that I'm against silly music with a sense of humor, I often love that. But when the vocals didn't bring any personality and the music couldn't back it up, well, it can end up pretty insufferable. So alright, now Wet Leg have brought in more members and are basically compressing their sense of humor and more serious side, in a way that makes a lot of these songs feel more like standard indie rock songs, for better or for worse, because while it isn't as embarrassing as their debut was at its worst, this still comes with a few of the same problems. They seem to think they're more innovative and more charming than they actually are, and they can't pull off a good groove to save their life. At least their debut had moments that could have been something. Now, based on everything I've said up to this point, it should go without saying that there is no song on this album as good as Chaise Longue. That was the best song on their debut by a landslide, and I'm starting to think they might never top it. But I'm actually kind of shocked by how little these songs leave any sort of positive impact on me. Even on the few moments that could have been promising, they find a way to screw it up. Like how the closing track actually has a decent Squid-esque guitar and drum groove, only to be swamped out by an overly loud bass and some god-awful guitar distortion, which I could probably adjust to sound better. Considering my lack of music production skills, that is not a compliment. And you know what? I wrote that before I found out this was produced by Dan Carey, who also produced Squid's first 2 albums, which ended up great as a result. So what the hell happened here? There's also Catch These Fists, in which I like the main guitar lick, but everything sounds too cluttered and fuzzy, especially the percussion. And Liquid Eyes, which actually has some pretty good guitar distortion, but the pieces can't all come together with such underpowered acoustic guitar and too many tinny higher frequencies which completely blow out the mix, at least the way I hear it. And these are just the tracks that I think were ruined. A lot of these songs just sound like a mess sonically and aren't well written either. Now, when discussing the lyrics on this album, I want to at least acknowledge that I am often a fan of art that tackles human complexities, and the way that we all can be flawed in our own unique ways, and how we're all more like each other than it seems on the surface. But when I say this album is all over the place and can't seem to decide what it wants to do, I don't mean that as a good thing. And I think a big part of the reason why is because Wet Leg let their silly side show so much in their music that without a specific gimmick or quirky narrative, it almost starts to feel like they're just trolling the audience. And you know what? If they were at least funny, I would give them a pass for that. But not only does Rhiannon Teasdale once again not bring any real personality in her vocal performances, and not only are the individual one-liners not as witty as she seems to think they are, but this album goes all over the place between self-empowerment, love songs, and obsession and desire. And again, I'm not against having a variety of themes on an album, but here there are only really a few themes and none of them are pulled off very well, and the album sequencing is a total mess. I mean, on Catch These Fists, she's trying to be tough and prove that people should be scared to mess with her. Unconvincingly, by the way. And is getting pissed at men approaching her flirtatiously, which, yeah, can be creepy depending on the context, but the way she describes it doesn't seem all that bad, or at least not worthy of the fury that she, again, unconvincingly tries to show. And yet, she spends a lot of this album being obsessive over others, and in some cases making similar moves on them. And while there's a self-aware part of me that feels like I shouldn't be one to judge as a 20-year-old privileged male, I also have enough real self-awareness to recognize that I deserve to call out hypocrisy when it's there, especially because I won't deny being a hypocrite sometimes myself. And when I say this, I'm mostly referring to the ways I critique art, by the way. And yes, I'm aware of the irony there. But then you get to the more lovesick, joyous moments, like Pawn Song or Divina Macal, which still aim for the same gimmicky, quirky vibe sonically, or at least the same vibe as their songs which do fall into those categories. But when you've built such a visible identity, in Wet Leg's case, it's ripping off handfuls of other bands without being remotely interesting, it does shape the ways that certain songs can have problems of tonal whiplash which might not be there if it weren't for the surrounding songs setting up that foundation. So yeah, this is basically indie rock for anyone too cool for the radio, but even as someone who still cares a little bit too much about being cool, I've been long willing to admit that mainstream alternative rock can be good, even the stuff that crosses over onto the Hot 100. Although it's been a while since that was really much of a thing that happened. Or at least I think so, I don't know, I've been so out of the loop on mainstream pop music. But I'll take most of that endless pit of sluggish, dull indie rock radio filler over this. I know I was really harsh in this review, and I typically try to be nicer than this, but you all know at the end of the day this is all just my opinion. And I genuinely think this album is a mess. Again, I try to be more positive in most of my reviews, but I can't even recommend this, nor do I have a lot of respect for it beyond the basic respect that I have for artists in general. I was going to give this a 5 out of 10, but honestly, strong 4. Unless you absolutely loved their debut, which I certainly didn't, I wouldn't even bother with this album. And even if you did, prepare to be disappointed. Alright, here I am multiple hours later, because I just realized I forgot to record an outro for this video. I was about to start editing and putting it all together, and I realized I forgot to record an outro. But yeah, these are all just my personal opinions on these albums. Feel free to let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Sorry, the lighting is kind of fuzzy. The screen probably looks all fuzzy because the lighting's all weird. But anyway, yeah, thank you for watching. Again, I'll be on vacation, so I may or may not do any uploads while I'm away. I might film some stuff on my vacation, although that's not going to be a priority. I'm going to be visiting with family, so I won't be spending too much time on album reviews. I might end up just making some reviews that are a lot more rushed. We'll see what happens. I might take the full 2 weeks off of even working on videos. We'll see. But for now, I'll be back soon. At least when I'm back from my vacation, I'll come back to working on album reviews, and I'll probably chip away on it a little bit while I'm away. With all that being said, I'm Simon. You're watching my YouTube channel. I'm sorry, I'm terrible at these outros. Anyway, alright, thanks for watching.